January 17, 1945. Near Aachen, Western Germany. The canvas convoy rolled to a halt beneath the skeletal remains of what had once been an oak-lined avenue. Frost clung to the shattered cobblestones, and the air carried the acrid tang of cordite mixed with the damp earth smell of a continent tearing itself apart. Inside the trucks, 43 German women sat in silence, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. They wore the threadbare remains of auxiliary uniforms, some from the Luftwaffe Communications Corps, others from munitions factories that no longer existed. Their hands, chapped and raw, clutched small bundles of personal effects: a photograph, a letter, a single wooden comb. They did not speak to one another. They had been taught not to speak unless spoken to, not to question, not to show weakness. Outside, American military police stamped their boots against the cold, their voices carrying across the morning in casual laughter, a sound so foreign to these women that several flinched as if struck. This was the beginning of something none of them had been prepared for, not by the rallies in Nuremberg, not by the carefully orchestrated newsreels, not by 12 years of methodical indoctrination. They were being transported to a prisoner processing facility near Liège, Belgium, where they would be documented, interrogated, and assessed. But the real interrogation had already begun the moment the American soldiers opened the truck gates and extended their hands, not in violence, but in assistance. One woman, Margaret Schultz, a 24-year-old typist from Stuttgart, would later write in her diary, discovered decades after her death, that she had expected to be shot. Instead, she was offered a cigarette and asked if she needed water. The war in Western Europe was entering its final, brutal months. The Rhine had not yet been crossed, but the inevitability of German collapse hung in the winter air like the smoke from 1,000 burning cities. These women were among the first, substantial groups of female German military auxiliaries to fall into American hands as the Allied advance ground eastward through the shattered geography of the Third Reich's western defenses. They had grown up in a nation that told them women were the sacred vessels of racial purity, the silent guardians of the home front, the mothers of a 1,000-year empire. They had been taught that their value lay in obedience, in sacrifice, in the submission of self to state. They had been shown images of enemy women as either debased, sexualized creatures corrupted by jazz and capitalism, or as masculine, hardened figures stripped of femininity by factory labor and moral degradation. Nothing in their education had prepared them for the women they were about to meet. The processing facility was a converted textile factory, its windows still bearing the scars of artillery fire from the autumn battles. Inside, the Americans had established a functional if austere operation. Rows of desks, medical stations, registration tables. The German women were led through in groups of 10, subjected to the bureaucratic machinery of documentation. Names, ranks, birthplaces, next of kin. But it was not the machinery that struck them. It was the women operating it. American Red Cross workers moved through the facility with an efficiency that seemed almost leisurely in its confidence. They wore clean uniforms, their hair styled in ways that seemed impossibly elaborate for wartime. They smiled. This detail appears again and again in the accounts that would eventually surface. American women smiled at them. Not the tight, controlled expressions of female functionaries in the Reich, but open, genuine smiles that reached their eyes. They made eye contact. They asked questions and waited for answers. They touched shoulders gently when offering directions. One Red Cross worker, noticing a German woman trembling from cold, simply removed her own scarf and placed it around the prisoner's shoulders without ceremony, without expectation of gratitude, and then moved on to the next task. Liesel Hartmann, who had served as a telephone operator in Cologne, described the experience in testimony given in 1978 to an oral history project. "I thought it was a trick. I thought they were trying to make us weak, to make us talk. We had been told that the Americans would use psychological torture, that they would pretend to be kind and then destroy us when we let our guard down. But there was no trick. They were simply themselves." What Hartmann and her fellow prisoners could not initially understand was that they were witnessing not a performance, but a reflection of a fundamentally different social contract. The American women working in that facility, nurses, clerks, translators, administrators, operated within a cultural framework that had granted them, however imperfectly, a degree of autonomy unknown in Nazi Germany. They had voted in elections before they were 30. They had chosen their occupations, at least within the constraints of gender norms that were themselves being rapidly challenged by wartime necessity. They spoke their minds to male officers with a directness that would have been unthinkable in Wehrmacht or SS facilities. They negotiated, they disagreed, they laughed at jokes without seeking permission. The contrast was not merely visible, it was tactile, audible, atmospheric. It permeated every interaction. Over the following weeks, as more German women were processed through Allied facilities from the Low Countries to Bavaria, a pattern of psychological dissonance emerged that would be documented in intelligence reports, letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. These women had expected cruelty and found bureaucracy. They had expected brutalization and found indifference mixed with occasional kindness. But more profoundly, they had expected to find women diminished by freedom, and instead found women enlarged by it. The revelation came in small moments, accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, until the weight of them shifted something foundational. At a facility in Maastricht, a group of female prisoners watched as an American nurse flatly refused an order from a male lieutenant, explaining that the medical protocol he suggested was outdated and potentially harmful. The two argued briefly, professionally, and the lieutenant conceded. The German women, who had witnessed this exchange while waiting for medical examinations, sat in stunned silence afterward. One of them, Anna Vogel, a former factory supervisor, finally whispered to the woman beside her, "She was not punished." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact that seemed to violate every principle she had been taught about hierarchy, gender, and authority. The food became a symbol, as it so often did in the testimonies of both prisoners of war and displaced persons in the European theater. The German women, accustomed to the steadily diminishing rations of the Reich's final years, ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread bulked with sawdust, margarine that tasted of chemicals, were confronted with American field rations that seemed to arrive from another universe. The sheer abundance was disorienting. Canned meat that was actual meat. Chocolate bars distributed casually, as if they were not precious commodities to be hoarded and hidden. White bread, soft and sweet. Coffee that tasted like coffee. But it was not merely the abundance. It was who had access to it. The American women ate the same food as the men. They did not wait to be served. They did not eat separately or last. They sat at the same tables, engaged in the same conversations, and reached for seconds without apology. For women who had been raised in a culture where female hunger was supposed to be modest, where the best portions went to men as a matter of natural order, this casual equality at mealtime was a quiet revolution made visible 3 times a day. Greta Mannheim, a former stenographer from Hamburg, recalled in a 1983 interview the moment she understood the deeper meaning of the American mess hall. "I watched a female lieutenant argue with a male captain over baseball while they ate. She was teasing him, mocking his team. He was laughing. They were equals in that moment. Not in rank, perhaps, but in their humanity. And I realized that in Germany, we had been taught to serve men their humanity while we swallowed ours." The cigarettes, too, became symbolic. American women smoked openly, without shame or concealment. They lit up after meals, during breaks, while working at their desks. They offered cigarettes to the German prisoners as casually as they offered them to each other. This small act, the sharing of tobacco between captor and captive, between victor and vanquished, between free woman and imprisoned woman, contained within it a presumption of shared humanity that the Nazi ideology had spent 12 years trying to extinguish. In the Reich, women who smoked in public were considered déclassés, morally suspect, tainted by foreign influence. Smoking was tolerated in private among certain social classes, but it was never celebrated as it was among the American servicewomen, who treated their cigarette breaks as moments of democratic assembly, huddled together against the cold, sharing light and conversation without regard to rank, beyond what military protocol demanded. The psychological impact of these accumulated observations cannot be overstated. These German women had been conditioned to believe that female autonomy led inevitably to social chaos, moral degradation, and the destruction of femininity itself. They had been shown propaganda images of American women as either frivolous creatures obsessed with cosmetics and Hollywood, or as mannish factory workers who had abandoned their natural roles. What they encountered instead were women who seemed to contain multitudes, competent and feminine, authoritative and warm, serious and playful, all without contradiction. Lieutenant Mary Phillips, a nurse from Pennsylvania working at a facility near Frankfurt in March 1945, recorded her observations in letters home that were later donated to the Veterans History Project. "The German girls watch us constantly. Not with hostility exactly, but with this intense curiosity, like we're specimens of something they were told didn't exist. Yesterday, one of them asked me through a translator if I was married. I said no. She asked if I wanted to be married. I said someday, maybe if I met the right person, but that I had other plans first. She looked at me like I'd told her I could fly." The medical examinations provided another point of jarring contrast. American military doctors and nurses treated the German women with clinical professionalism, but also with a basic dignity that many had not expected. They were given privacy during examinations. They were asked for consent before procedures. They were explained their own medical conditions in terms they could understand. For women who had been processed through systems where their bodies were treated as state property, this restoration of bodily autonomy, however limited by their status as prisoners, was profoundly destabilizing. Several women reported in later testimonies that they had expected forced sterilization, based on rumors that had circulated in Germany about Allied intentions. When this did not occur, when they were instead treated for malnutrition, lice, and minor injuries, and then released back to the general prisoner population, the cognitive dissonance deepened. If the Americans were the monsters they had been told about, why did they heal rather than harm? If American women were degraded by their freedoms, why did they seem so wholly, unself-consciously themselves? The interrogations conducted by American intelligence officers often included female translators and analysts, women who spoke perfect German, and who approached their work with a combination of professional skepticism and human curiosity. These interrogations, documented in dozens of reports now housed in various military archives, reveal a consistent pattern of surprise among German prisoners when confronted with educated, linguistically skilled American women who wielded considerable authority in the intelligence apparatus. One interrogation report from April 1945, involving a German signals officer named Elsa Brecht, notes that the subject appeared more disturbed by the presence and authority of the female translator than by the questions themselves. Subject repeatedly addressed answers to male officer, even when questions were posed by translator, until explicitly instructed otherwise. Subject's discomfort appeared to stem not from hostility, but from lack of framework for interaction with woman in position of intellectual authority. The translators, for their part, found themselves inadvertently serving as ambassadors of a different ideological model. They were often educated women, many from immigrant families who had fled Europe in the 1930s, who brought with them not only language skills but also a living refutation of Nazi claims about the degeneracy of emigrated Germans. They had left the Reich and flourished. They had preserved their culture while embracing democratic values. They had become professors, analysts, writers, translators, roles that would have been foreclosed to them had they remained. As spring arrived and the war ground toward its apocalyptic conclusion, the number of German women in Allied custody increased exponentially. The collapse of the Ruhr Pocket, the suicide of Hitler, the surrender of Berlin. Each event sent new waves of refugees and prisoners westward into Allied-controlled territory. Women who had served in anti-aircraft batteries, in communications networks, in the vast administrative apparatus of the Nazi state, suddenly found themselves stripped of the ideology that had given their suffering meaning. They had endured years of bombing, of rationing, of loss. They had sacrificed brothers and fathers and sons to a cause they had been taught was sacred. And now they sat in displaced persons camps and prisoner processing facilities, watching American women hand out chocolate to German children, watching American women drive trucks and issue orders and laugh freely. And they confronted a terrible question. What if everything we were told was a lie? The answer came slowly, painfully, through accumulated experience rather than sudden revelation. It came in the realization that the American women were not special specimens, not exceptional individuals, but simply the product of a system that assumed women were fully human and worthy of rights. It came in the understanding that competence and femininity were not opposites, that authority did not require cruelty, that freedom did not automatically lead to chaos. Hildegard Neumann, who had worked in a munitions factory near Essen, and who spent 3 months in a displaced persons camp in 1945, wrote in a letter to her sister in 1947, "The American women were not better than us. That is what I finally understood. They were not smarter or stronger or braver. They were simply allowed to be themselves completely, without apology. And that allowance made all the difference." The chocolate became, in many accounts, the most potent symbol of this ideological gulf. American soldiers and relief workers distributed chocolate with an almost absurd generosity. To children, to prisoners, to displaced persons, to anyone who looked hungry. For the German women who received these small bars of sweetness, the chocolate represented something beyond mere calories. It represented surplus, yes, but also a kind of carelessness with abundance that spoke to a fundamentally different relationship between the individual and the state. In Nazi Germany, scarcity had been weaponized, turned into a virtue, made into a tool of control. Every shortage was an opportunity to demand greater sacrifice, to identify hoarders and defeatists, to police consumption and punish excess. The chocolate, distributed freely and without strings, without expectation of gratitude or loyalty, spoke to a different social contract, one where abundance was assumed to be shared, where generosity did not require submission. Maria Koch, who had been a nurse in a military hospital in Berlin before the city fell, described in a 1969 interview the moment she truly grasped the difference. An American woman, I never learned her name, gave me a chocolate bar. I tried to thank her, to express my gratitude in my broken English, to show her that I understood the value of what she had given me. She looked confused by my intensity. She said, "It's just chocolate, honey. We've got tons of it." Just chocolate. We've got tons of it. Those words stayed with me for years. It was not about the chocolate. It was about a worldview where there was enough food, enough freedom, enough room for people to be human without it being a threat to the social order. The American Red Cross workers, the nurses, the administrators, the WACs and the translators, and the drivers, and the Signal Corps' women. They were not engaged in a conscious campaign to convert German women to democracy. They were simply doing their jobs, being themselves, operating within the framework of their own cultural assumptions. But in doing so, they became living contradictions of everything. The Nazi regime had taught its female population about the supposed consequences of female emancipation. The transformation this wrought was neither immediate nor universal. Many German women clung to their ideological conditioning, interpreting the kindness of their captors as weakness, the freedom of American women as immodesty. Some maintained their commitment to Nazi principles well into the post-war years, explaining away the evidence of their senses through elaborate rationalizations. But for others, the experience of encountering American women in positions of authority, competence, and unself-conscious confidence planted seeds of doubt that would germinate slowly in the ruins of the post-war world. By summer 1945, with the war in Europe concluded and the enormity of Nazi crimes becoming undeniably clear, the psychological impact of these encounters deepened. German women confronted not only the reality of military defeat, but also the moral catastrophe of having supported, or at least acquiesced to, a regime of industrialized genocide. In this context, the memory of American women's casual confidence became intertwined with larger questions of complicity, resistance, and the possibility of moral renewal. Some found in the example of American women a model for reconstruction, not the reconstruction of buildings and infrastructure, though that was desperately needed, but the reconstruction of self. If women could be competent and kind, authoritative and generous, professional and feminine, then perhaps there were other false dichotomies that could be challenged, other rigid categories that could be questioned. Others experienced the contrast as a source of lasting shame and regret. Christa Bauer, who had been an enthusiastic member of the League of German Girls before the war, wrote in her memoir published in 1977, "When I saw the American women, I understood that I had been robbed of something I did not even know existed, the possibility of becoming myself. I had been taught that self-negation was virtue, that sacrifice was identity. The American women had not been taught this, and they were not lesser for it. They were fuller, more complete. I mourned for the girl I might have been." The post-war years brought these women face to face with the necessity of building new lives in a shattered landscape. Germany was divided, occupied, economically devastated, and morally bankrupt. The values that had structured their youth lay in ruins alongside the cities. Many found themselves drawn to the democratic institutions established in the Western zones of occupation, institutions that granted women rights they had never possessed under either the Weimar Republic or the Nazi regime. The Basic Law adopted in West Germany in 1949 included Article 3, which guaranteed equality before the law regardless of sex, a provision influenced in part by the Allied occupation authorities and by German women who had witnessed alternative models of female citizenship. The path from observation to implementation was neither straight nor simple, and true equality remained aspirational for decades. But the seed planted by those encounters in 1945, the lived example of women, operating as full citizens, contributed to a slow evolution in German political and social culture. The American women who served in the European theater during the final months of the war and the early occupation period were themselves products of an imperfect democracy. They returned to a nation that still denied many of them equal pay, that barred women from numerous professions, that expected them to surrender their wartime roles and return to domestic life. The contrast between American rhetoric about freedom and American reality regarding women's rights was stark, and many female veterans found themselves fighting new battles for recognition and equality in the post-war years. But in that moment of encounter, in those processing facilities and displaced persons camps and occupation offices, they represented something more than American reality. They represented American potential. They embodied the promise that freedom and competence need not be enemies, that women could exercise authority without becoming masculine caricatures, that democracy might actually mean something beyond the right of men to vote. The German women who witnessed this carried the memory forward, sometimes consciously, sometimes buried beneath layers of trauma and survival. They raised daughters in the rubble of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that rebuilt West Germany into a prosperous democracy. Those daughters, in turn, would lead the feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s, demanding the full realization of Article 3's promise. The chain of influence was not direct or deterministic, but neither was it absent. History moves through such moments of recognition, when the supposed inevitability of a social order is confronted with evidence of an alternative. The German women who encountered American women in 1945 experienced such a moment. They saw women who had been granted the space to develop their full capabilities, who had not been forced to choose between femininity and competence, between domestic life and public participation. They saw women who could give orders and crack jokes, who could run a field hospital and paint their nails, who could be tough and tender without apology. And in seeing this, some of them began to imagine different futures for themselves and their daughters. The symbolic weight of these encounters extends beyond the individual transformations they precipitated. They represent a collision between totalitarianism and democracy at the level of daily life, of embodied experience. The Nazi regime had attempted to engineer every aspect of society, including gender relations, in service of its racialized utopian vision. Women were assigned clear roles: mothers of the race, keepers of the home, silent supporters of male authority. Deviation from this script was treated as ideological betrayal. The American women who arrived in Germany in 1945 were not ideological warriors in any conscious sense, but they were living refutations of Nazi gender ideology nonetheless. Their very presence, capable, confident, unself-conscious, demonstrated that the restrictive model imposed on German women was a choice, not a necessity. Women could be otherwise. This realization was, for many, as liberating as it was devastating. It meant acknowledging that years of sacrifice had been in service of a lie, that the constraints they had accepted as natural were actually imposed, that their suffering had been instrumentalized by a regime that valued them only as instruments of reproduction and production. But it also meant recognizing that alternatives existed, that change was possible, that the post-war world might offer opportunities that the pre-war and wartime worlds had foreclosed. The American chocolate, distributed so freely, became in memory a sacrament of this alternative possibility. Sweet, abundant, shared without hierarchy or hoarding. It represented not just material wealth, though that was part of it, but a different orientation toward the world, one less characterized by zero-sum thinking, less obsessed with scarcity and sacrifice, more willing to imagine that there might be enough food, enough freedom, enough space for human flourishing. For everyone. This was, of course, an idealized image. American abundance was built on its own forms of exploitation and exclusion, its own hierarchies and hypocrisies. The German women did not see the poverty of American inner cities, the segregation of the American South, the struggles of American women workers for equal pay and reproductive rights. They saw the surface: clean uniforms, confident demeanors, casual authority, and projected onto it their own longings for what they had lost or never possessed. But idealized or not, the image had power. It provided a vision of what might be possible, a benchmark against which to measure their own society's reconstruction. When West Germany debated women's rights in the late 1940s and 50s, when women organized for equal pay and reproductive freedom in the 1960s and 70s, the memory of those encounters, direct or transmitted, provided a counter-narrative to traditional justifications for female subordination. The epilogue to this story is written not in grand, historical turning points but in small cumulative changes. It is written in the steady increase in female university enrollment in West Germany through the 1950s and 60s. It is written in the legal reforms that gradually expanded women's economic and reproductive autonomy. It is written in the political careers of women like Anne-Marie Renger and Hildegard Hambrucher, who entered politics in the post-war era and fought for the realization of constitutional promises. It is written in the simple fact that the daughters and granddaughters of the women who encountered American confidence in 1945 inherited a different set of possibilities than their mothers had known. The transformation was incomplete, contested, ongoing. Patriarchal structures proved resilient, and the promise of equality remained partially unfulfilled. But the encounter had opened a window that could not be fully closed again. Once German women had seen that women could be otherwise, could be competent and kind, authoritative and generous, fully human without apology, the old justifications for subordination lost some of their power to compel. In the end, what shook the German women captives was not American military might, though they had witnessed that in devastating abundance. It was not American technological superiority, though that too was evident. It was something simpler and more profound: the evidence that women granted freedom could flourish rather than fail, that equality did not destroy social order but enriched it, that democracy extended to include women made those women neither masculine nor immoral, but simply more fully themselves. This was the lesson contained in every shared cigarette, every casual conversation, every moment of competence displayed without self-consciousness. This was the meaning encoded in the chocolate, the coffee, the clean uniforms, the painted nails, the laughter without permission. This was the truth that 12 years of totalitarian conditioning had tried to suppress but could not erase, that there were other ways to be human, other ways to be woman, other ways to build a society. And once seen, this truth could not be unseen. It lodged in memory, in the stories women told their daughters, in the quiet refusal to accept that subordination was inevitable or natural. It became part of the sediment from which the post-war world was built, grain by grain, choice by choice, one woman after another deciding that what she had seen was real and that it pointed toward a better future. The American women who represented this possibility went home to their own imperfect democracy, their own struggles for recognition and equality. They did not know, could not know, the long-term impact of their simple presence. They had been doing their jobs, serving their time, trying to process the chaos of Europe's collapse into some kind of administrative order. They had shared their chocolate because they had chocolate to share. They had exercised authority because they had been granted authority. They had been themselves because being themselves was not, in their context, a revolutionary act. But in the eyes of the German women who watched them, who remembered them, who measured their own possibilities against the example they provided, they had been more than themselves. They had been ambassadors of a different way of organizing human relations, proof that the rigid hierarchies of Nazi Germany were chosen rather than inevitable, evidence that freedom could coexist with order, that competence had no gender, that there was enough food, enough space, enough humanity, for everyone to be fully themselves. This was the revolution contained in a chocolate bar, the ideology encoded in a casual smile, the promise implicit in a woman saying no to a man without fear. This was what shook the German women captives in 1945. Not cruelty or vengeance, but the simple, devastating evidence that they had been lied to about what women could be and do, and that somewhere, somehow, in the ruins of their shattered world, they might begin to claim for themselves the fullness of being they had witnessed in their captors. The oak trees along the avenue near Aachen, where this story began, eventually grew back. The shattered cobblestones were replaced. The cities rebuilt themselves stone by stone. And in the slow reconstruction of German society, the women who had glimpsed an alternative carried that vision forward, imperfectly and incompletely, but persistently. They had been shaken free of certainties that had seemed unassailable, shaken awake to possibilities that had seemed unimaginable. And in that shaking, however painful, lay the beginning of something new, the recognition that freedom, extended fully and without qualification to all people, might be not the enemy of order but its prerequisite, not the destroyer of society but its fulfillment, not a weakness to be feared but a strength to be celebrated. This was the truth encoded in every encounter between German captives and American confidence in 1945. A truth as simple and as revolutionary as chocolate, shared without hesitation, as laughter offered without permission, as competence displayed without apology.